I think we're just getting started. No introductions from Constanza. Thank you to everyone for coming today. Before we get started, I really want to thank two people in particular. First, Eric Klein, who very graciously sponsors the RAS Division Reference and Bibliography Award, or I should say the Bibliography Award. And second, to our wonderful recipient of last year's prize, the incredibly patient, now available on audio, András Koerner. So Andras, thank you so much for being with us here today. I want to start by asking you about a piece of ephemera that you describe in your books, which is your great-grandmother's recipe book. Was this something that you always knew about? Was it something that you found? Have you found or encountered any other bits of family food history that kind of moved you and affected you in the same way?
Yes, I learned about the existence of my great-grandmother's recipe manuscript in around 2000 or so. For 7 years in the 1980s, I was recording an oral history with my mother in Budapest during my visits there. And when I mentioned this to my aunt who was living here in New York, and she said that, well, there is a large cardboard box of stuff from great-grandmother, and why don't you take a look? It might interest you. And indeed it interested me because it was like a time capsule. It included lots of stuff, manuscripts, table linen, china, the clothes that she wore at her daughter's wedding in 1901, etc., etc. And one of the things in the cardboard box was a booklet containing approximately 130 recipes. Another booklet contained all the rough drafts of all the letters she wrote in the 1870s. And so that got me going, and I started reconstructing her recipes, and that was the beginning. And it is interesting to mention that the reason why this stuff survived in this cardboard box, that I spent the last weeks of 1944 and the first 2 weeks in 1945 in the Budapest ghetto, and my maternal grandmother was taking care of me there. And we survived the Holocaust and the whole events, and but in terribly bad health. So in 1946, the family decided that she should emigrate to the United States and join her daughter there. And she was in her early 60s, and she could not speak a word English, and so on and so forth. And so she felt that she needs to take all the stuff remaining from her mother, my great-grandmother, and that's how it survived. Had this stuff remained in Hungary, in Budapest, I'm absolutely sure that it would have been dispersed, thrown out, sold, whatever. So it was a series of real luck that it survived. And as I said, it was like a time capsule. And it enabled me to write my first book, which was about her daily life and cooking. I did not want to write her biography, nor did I want to write family history. What interested me, the minutiae of daily life, and of course cooking was an important part of a woman's daily life, particularly in the 19th century. So that was my first book. And since it had two subjects, one was the daily life and the household, and the other was her cooking, road led in two directions from my first book. One direction was the daily life, the Alltagsgeschichte, as the Germans say. And I wrote later then two books about the daily life, not just of my great-grandmother, but all the major groups of Hungarian Jews before the Holocaust. What interested me how those people, those very, very different, diverse people lived. And the way in the other direction was the cooking. And then I wrote a little bit later a monograph on Hungarian-Jewish cuisine, which presented, again, the cuisine of all the different kinds of Hungarian Jews, because there was no uniform cuisine among Hungarian Jews. I mean, people who were, say, Hasidic and Orthodox, they cook differently than people who were assimilated, and some of them stopped keeping kosher, so obviously. So almost all my subsequent books, and by now I published something like 15 of them, were, not all, but most of them were basically these two types, either the minutiae of daily life, and the other was the history of cuisine.
Actually, since you just brought it up and started to unpack some of the nuances of Hungarian culinary culture, maybe we could stay there for a minute. So, what do people get wrong about Hungarian culinary history and its food culture, past and present, and especially Jewish Hungarian food culture, past and present?
Well, for one thing, food history is not really does not have a long history on its own, and there were lots of articles about food history, Jewish food history, and also about Hungarian food history, and they are riddled with errors because basically they were superficial works, not at all scholarly, and frequently they just copied anecdotes that they read somewhere in another book, and these anecdotes, and many of the times incorrect and unfounded anecdotes, they kept just recurring in all these publications, and to this day there is no comprehensive history of Hungarian cooking, Hungarian cuisine, and in fact there is this paradox situation that I wrote this book, Jewish Cuisine in Hungary, which is a fairly comprehensive history of all culinary culture, including not just food and dishes, but the social background of them, the food production, the marketing of food, the controlling, the kashrut, and so on and so forth, and of course the history of Hungarian Jewish cookbooks, which is really interesting that Hungary, at least in the middle of the 19th century and generally in the 19th century, was absolutely in the forefront, at the vanguard of the world, because though Germany had the first two Jewish cookbooks, but the third Jewish cookbook in the world was published in Hungary. And in fact, aside from England and Germany, Hungary published the largest number of different Jewish cookbooks in the 19th century, more than the United States, more than the Russian Empire. And of course, you have to remember the Russian Empire had the largest number of Jews at that time in the world. So it's a paradox that Hungary was so much the vanguard. And one of the reasons was that Hungarian Jewish cookbooks were published in German. And German was sort of the common language of much of Central European Jewry. And so these cookbooks published in Hungary in German, they could be read in Bohemia, they could be read of course in Germany, in Austria, and there is this strange paradox that Austria, which of course is German speaking, did not have a Jewish cookbook, an independent Jewish cookbook that is not like a few Jewish recipes published in a non-Jewish cookbook until the 20th century, because on one hand they could use the Jewish cookbooks arriving from Germany, and on the other hand, they could use the Jewish cookbooks from Hungary, and because they were all written in German.
You know, you said so many things that I think I want you to expound upon, but obviously we have a limited time for this conversation. So I think you've mentioned kind of two motivating factors in your food studies research. So one was the fact that you didn't think it had been done well before, that it had been kind of superficial, this culinary history of Hungary. And the other is this family connection and the connection to Alltagsgeschichte and the specificity of your great grandmother's recipe book. So in your experience, you know, with the field of food history, I'm very interested about why people get involved with it. So in your experience, how typical is it, do you think, that researchers have a kind of lived family connection to the recent past that they maybe want to explore more deeply?
Well, at least in Hungary, I can only speak of Hungary. It's very rare. I mean, in fact, this, what I called, quote unquote, a time capsule is absolutely unique in Hungary. From no other family has such a large group of documents, and particularly documents related to the to culinary culture, survived. And because I had this extensive oral history with my mother, who was raised by my great-grandmother, she could remember minute details of my great-grandmother's household, where the different pieces of furniture stood. I mean, she could draw me their whole apartment in a small town in Western Hungary, and all practically a minute-by-minute account of their daily life. So this oral source from my mother and the documentary source, that all these booklets with my great-grandmother's recipes and letters, they all strengthened each other. It was like puzzle pieces, and luckily the puzzle pieces were so complete that patiently putting the puzzle pieces together, a picture emerged, and the picture of my great-grandmother's daily life, and that's absolutely unique. And in fact, 2 years ago, I curated an exhibition of the history of Hungarian-Jewish cuisine and culinary culture in Budapest, and a very large part of the exhibition consisted the stuff from my great-grandmother, because individual, a piece here, a piece there, did survive from other families, but not as complete and reasonably comprehensive as from my great-grandmother.
So it's really incredible that you had this material, as you say, this time capsule, these kind of unpublished recipes, this cardboard box as an entry point into the past. But I'm wondering about the more recent past also, and you know, your mother and your grandmother and cooking in your house and what that was like, and if cookbooks were something that they inherently valued and that had a special meaning. Any cookbooks that, you know, do you recall were especially cherished in your household?
No, they hardly ever used cookbooks. Because like in many families, I would say in most families in the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, people rather used handwritten recipe collections, which they copied from newspapers, they were dictated to them by friends, by other family members, and that's what they used. And by the way, these handwritten recipe collections, they give a better idea of what people actually ate than cookbooks, because cookbooks, and particularly early cookbooks, early Jewish and non-Jewish cookbooks, were really not reflecting exactly what people ate. They were more aspirational, so to speak, what people would have loved to eat, but actually in many cases did not prepare. So while early cookbooks are tremendously interesting as a historical document, they really don't give a full and realistic picture of what people actually ate.
I mean, I think that's true today too. We all buy.
More.
I think that's true today. We all buy cookbooks, kind of, with the hope that one day we will have the time and the energy to make these elaborate recipes, when really we're making the same, however many dishes over and over again.
And another interesting thing is that early Jewish cookbooks, in most cases, I would not say all cases, but particularly the earliest ones, in all cases, they did not include a single typical, uniquely Jewish dish. They all the dishes they included were Christian dishes adopted for kashrut, and because the early Jewish cookbooks, and frankly, I think the early cookbooks for non-Jews also, at least in the 19th century, they were intended for the middle class people. Both them middle class people used them, and middle class Jews, they wanted to eat as elegantly as their Christian counterparts. So what mattered to them is to have kosher versions of Christian dishes, and they either they knew how to prepare cholent and kugel and whatever typical Jewish dish, or they felt that those were sort of old-fashioned dishes, and they were more interested in the elegant haute cuisine of Christian middle class.
That's really interesting. It's something that you explained very well in your book. And I think one of the things that I found most exciting about early Jewish cookbooks is that it seems to kind of simultaneously exist at the meeting place of culinary history, cultural history, book history, while also treating cookbooks as a distinct class of materials that require their own tools of analyses. So please, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your methods. How do you read a cookbook? Where do you start? What do you look for? How does cookbook research differ from historical research into recipes?
Interesting. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was a conference in Warsaw, and I was asked to give a short talk about Jewish cuisine as a documentary source for historical research. And I gave the somewhat tongue-in-cheek title to my talk, How to Read a Cookbook. And of course, everybody knows how to read a cookbook. But what I meant, that a cookbook can be read not only for the dishes it contains and the recipes, but also what it tells us about a long ago period. I mean, we have to study its language. For example, my great-grandmother's manuscript was written in German in old-fashioned Frakturschrift, which I had to learn to read, and it's not. I can tell you, it's not easy, and it uses a kind of German which is not only Austrian German, but even sort of like that Western Hungarian version of Austrian German with some words that no Austrian would use today, and so one has to examine and research the language, and also the publisher. One has that how was it published, for whom was it published. Of course, one has to research the author who wrote it, and also what was the public of those recipes. And also, what influences can you detect in the particular cookbook and or manuscript, because particularly old cookbooks, there was no copyright, really. Mm-hmm. So everybody freely copied recipes from other cookbooks. And in many cases, and of course never crediting the source. So where they copied the recipes from, that also is an important information, historical information. And so on. I mean, I could go on for an hour on this subject, but briefly, that's it.
No, those are a lot of really important differences thinking about, and one thing you do talk about is the different measuring systems also.
Yes, that's true, but that in a way is important, but not as important as the public, the the language, the influences, and the publisher published it. Why did they publish it? And so on. So yes, the measuring system is important because in a way it dates the recipes. I mean, for example, when my great-grandmother started writing her manuscripts, there were different. There was no metric system still in Hungary, and it was enacted only in if I recall correctly, in the 1870s or 80s. And for a long time, people still used the old weight and system, and they gradually switched over to the metric system. Frequently, my great-grandmother, for example, gave the quantities according to their price. I don't know, vanilla or candied fruit for 12 kreuzers.
Right.
So you had to try to figure out what that meant, because who knows what 12 kreuzer bought in the 1860s or 70s.
Right. You have to consult Hungarian inflation tables from the 19th century.
Exactly.
So we've kind of unpacked.
It's tremendously interesting to study old cookbooks and the recipe manuscripts, and I would say less for the dishes included and almost more for the information one gains about the cultural and social conditions of the period.
So part of what I find distinct and fascinating about your work generally, and this has already come up today, is the way you move between oral and written sources in your research into culinary history. So it's especially true for your earlier book, Jewish Cuisine in Hungary, but also true for early Jewish cookbooks. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about the differences between the oral Torah and the written Torah as it pertains to food history. What can we learn, from the past, from the oral Torah, from interviews, from oral histories, from archival audio, that we cannot learn from written sources? And what can we learn from the written sources that we couldn't learn from the oral sources?
Again, I used this metaphor before, but I'm short on metaphors, so I will use it again. It's like puzzle pieces fitting together or not fitting together, and completing each other. And so in early Jewish cookbooks, of course, as I mentioned, I used my mother's oral history, which the written form was like several hundred pages, and I have been living from it ever since, long after the passing of my mother. And it was particularly rich in information about my great-grandmother's household because my mother, up until age 6, was raised by her grandmother, my great. And at Jewish Cuisine in Hungary, I had a particularly fortunate situation that there is an organization in Central Europe called Centropa, and they record oral histories from old Jewish people, and they particularly focus on life before the Holocaust, and that's important, and that's why I chose actually to focus both in cuisine and in daily life, the research of the everyday life on the period before the Holocaust, because for understandable, obvious reasons, there is a huge literature about the Holocaust, but there is far, far less, incomparably less, about life before, and particularly not fact-based, exact information. And this was like a gold mine for me, these histories recorded by Centropa. They go back to the late 19th century, and then they are about the period up until 1945. And because it's available digitally, it could be researched, and that was the reason why I could so much, and I could quote from them so profusely in early in Jewish cuisine in Hungary. So in both cases, both in early Jewish cookbooks and in Jewish cuisine in Hungary, it was a fortunate situation that I had oral sources available. They are not always available to this extent, and it's not one size fits all.
So I'm curious to move really more properly into cookbooks and the issues around cookbooks for the rest of this discussion. And also I want to encourage people to leave questions in the chat so that we can get to them later. I'm curious if it came as any kind of surprise to win a bibliography award. You know, did that reflect your internal conception of your research at all?
Okay, I have to make a big confession. I had no idea about the Bibliography Award before, but I was absolutely delighted and joyful learning about it, and that it was awfully nice that you folks awarded it to me. And of course, I use bibliographies in my research, but I consider for my own private purposes bibliographies only as a tool that is very helpful in my research. But in all these books that I have written, I prepared only in one book there is a bibliography, and that's the bibliography of Hungarian-Jewish cookbooks before 1945. And since in those years there were not as many cookbooks published as we have today, all the cookbooks, it consists only 12 books, 12 different titles from the period preceding 1945. So I prepared one single biography and bibliography, and it's a very short one. But of course I use it, and they are tremendous help. But for example, for Jewish books, as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, there are only two bibliographies. One was prepared by a Norwegian researcher, Henry Noteker, and the other one was prepared a little bit later in 2017 by a German fellow called Wolf-Dieter Grün. And both are helpful, but both are imperfect. I mean, there are, as I learned when I was researching and writing early Jewish cookbooks, and there are quite a few books missing from them. For example, Henry Noteker only quotes the title of his first Jewish cookbook printed in Hebrew letters, because he believed that no copy of the book survived. So he only knew the title of it from 19th-century advertisements. And I was lucky that later on I managed to find 3 copies. 2 of them I know the place where they are kept, and one I know that it exists, but I don't know where it's kept.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you this question, is that, you know, whatever your self-conception of a bibliographer may be, I think the thing that made this book so worthy of the prize is that it really came very naturally to you. So 2 of the standout chapters of the book are about cookbooks that were almost completely unknown beforehand, or known only in this kind of very tangential way. So we have the first Jewish cookbook printed in Hebrew characters from 1854. That's an incredible chapter. And the first Jewish cookbook published in Hungary in 1840. So how did you go about doing this cookbook bibliography and finding these gaps, as you say? You know, what is it? How do you differ? How does it differ from any other type of research that you might do into book history?
Well, the first Jewish cookbook published in Hungary at the really, really early date, 1840, that was not unknown, actually. A copy of it is kept in the Hungarian National Library in Budapest, except for, again, I have to go back to what I said, that food history is a really, really underdeveloped field of scholarly research. And so there was this book sitting there in the National Library in plain sight, except for nobody took notice of it. and so on. And I was in touch with, of course, I researched in the National Library, other cookbooks, and the National Library, like a Library of Congress, supposedly has all the books published in Hungary, except for not all of them. So some of them are missing, and I had to dig at with collectors of cookbooks, and it's like trying all avenues, and one of them hope that they will click eventually. It's not a one-way thing, and sometimes it involves, like in this 1854 cookbook in Hebrew letters, it involves detective work, and frankly, it requires an amount of luck, because I'm sure Henry Notaker, that wonderful Norwegian bibliographer of Jewish cookbooks and other cookbooks also, tried his best to locate a copy, and he did not manage to locate a copy. And I was lucky and managed to locate 2 copies and an additional one, of which I don't know where it's kept. So it's trying always, and sort of hoping that eventually you get there in perhaps by detours and whatever, but eventually you would gather it together.
So you mentioned working with collectors. So I'm curious if you collect cookbooks yourself or collect any kind of aspect of Jewish history yourself. I think cookbook collecting is incredibly fascinating, and there are probably many of us here on this call who do this professionally, or at least semi-professionally, and are interested, in some of your tips about how to find these old cookbooks.
Well, my primary interest is cultural, social history of cuisine, or Jewish cuisine specifically, and of course, the history of Jewish cookbooks is an important part of the history of culinary culture. But and I'm a maniac for books, and I have lots of books. But I'm not really a systematic collector of cookbooks, though already in my teens I thought that reading cookbooks was a great deal of fun, and at that time I had no idea that I would do research later on. And I had no intention as a teenager to learn to cook, but I love to read cookbooks. And at the present, I have probably about 600 cookbooks, but many of them are really original old cookbooks. I mean, particularly not from the 19th century. I mean, if I come across a 19th century cookbook and it's for a good price, of course I have no reason why I should not buy it. But for my purposes as a researcher, a reprint is just as good as the original. So I'm not really a collector, except for I have lots of cookbooks, but they are not really rarities by any means.
You're not a collector, but you've collected many things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I have then thousands of books on other subjects, because I mean, another field of my research is Jewish history of daily life and cultural history and social history. So much is available online these days, but not everything. So of course I have to buy books for my research, for my books I'm writing. And for instance, a great deal is available online. Currently I'm at work on a monograph on a Hungarian-born Jewish Austrian writer called Moritz Gottlieb Zafir, who was born in the 18th century and died in the middle of the 19th century, and who happened to be, among others, the first food writer who specialized in Jewish food. wrote the first such articles, and fairly scholarly articles in the 1840s. And almost all his books, and he wrote hundreds and hundreds of books, he was incredibly prolific. They are available online because German 19th-century cookbooks and even more 19th-century newspapers are all scanned and available online. But some of the stuff that this Maurice Gottlieb Zafir published when at the beginning of his career, still in Budapest, still in Hungary, is not available because in Hungary they don't scan and digitize as many newspapers and books as in Germany. So I had to go to Budapest and study and copy them in a library. But of course, the internet is a huge, huge help.
So we had a question that touches upon something you just said. So which was that a question from the audience, which was, do you cook yourself? Have you made any of the recipes in the cookbook? So as a teen, you dismissed this idea of becoming a great cook, but did you get to it later in life?
Well, I started cooking, frankly, when I got divorced, because I thought either I need a girlfriend or I have to learn cooking. And at that point in my life, learning cooking seemed easier. And so I have been cooking and have been a rather passionate home cook since the 1980s, 90s, I would say. And I cooked through every single recipe in Jacques Pepin's cookbook, and I'm a sort of an old pedant, and so if I to learn something, I try to learn it systematically and reasonably well, and that enabled me to reconstruct my great-grandmother's recipes. And my first book, A Taste of the Past, which was published by the University Press of New England, later also in Hungary, I wrote it in English originally. That includes about 100 reconstructed recipes of my great-grandmother. And of course, reconstructing an old 19th century recipe, that takes lots of doing. I mean, several tries, and it's not like straight line process.
Yeah, you talk about this quite nicely in early Jewish cookbooks of the kind of what it is like to actually cook these old recipes. And one of the standout chapters is really about finding a lost dish. So I'm curious, maybe if you could say a little bit more about those experiences.
Well, the problem is that cookbooks were a tremendous help in people's in the history of the culinary culture, but on the other hand, they had advantages because what was published in cookbooks that became sort of semi-codified as what a certain cuisine is, and those which for those dishes, recipes that for what reason, one reason or the other, did not get recorded in cookbooks, they tended to become forgotten. And so what interested me is to try to reconstruct as close as possible the cuisine of my great-grandmother as she cooked it, what she actually used. And handwritten recipe collections are far more helpful in this regard than printed.
So you've said a little bit more about, kind of what's next for you in terms of your next research project. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what's next for the field of food history and Jewish food history. Have there been any kind of new research methods that you find exciting? Do you see any of these impacting your work, or do you think it's mostly because it's so connected to you to the social experience of everyday lives that you can continue with the sources you've been using.
Well, let's start with the history of Jewish cuisine. There are huge, huge gaps in it. I mean, to me, the most painful gap is that to this day, there is no comprehensive monograph on Jewish cookbooks published in German, and meaning not only in Germany, but in Bohemia, in Hungary, and so on and so forth. And of course, not only the world's first Jewish cookbook was published in Germany, in the state of Baden. Just a footnote, it was written by a Catholic guy who was a personal chef of the Prince of Baden, the state of Baden. And that it did not disturb anybody. I mean, according to his preface, the Jews of Karlsruhe asked him to write a Jewish cookbook, and he went to the household of these various Jews in Karlsruhe, meaning all probably assimilated and middle-class Jews, and then he, as he says in his preface, he reworked them to make them more similar to haute cuisine. That much for authenticity, but okay. The world's first Jewish cookbook was published in Germany, and also the second one. And generally, there's a huge gap that there is no monograph on it. There are separate essays, articles on various details of Jewish cookbooks in German, but not really a comprehensive monograph. And I toyed with the idea of undertaking it, but I'm 83 years old and I have lots of other projects, and I think I will leave this to others. Constance, wouldn't you like to do it? And right now I'm working on two books. One is I'm writing together, co-authoring it with Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, who was my example I wish to follow in researching the history of Jewish cookbooks. She's an absolutely wonderful person who's actually started the serious scholarly research of all Jewish cookbooks in the 1880s. I mean, again, that shows how late this whole field started, and who became then a dear friend and wrote prefaces to several of my books. And we have been working on this cultural history of gefilte fish together with her. She and I are collaborating on this. And that's one book I'm working on now. And the other, it's a much bigger undertaking, this monograph on Moritz Gottlieb Zafir. And new thing for me, because though I wrote one other book on literary history, but it is really primarily the history of literature and journalism and the newspaper business, and also I have translated German texts into English before, but it includes an anthology of Zafir's writing, so I have to translate tons of German stuff, and mind you, 19th-century German language stuff into English, which is quite a conceited idea, considering that I don't know either of the languages well. I don't know German well, and I don't know English well. So it took some self-confidence to try to attempt it. But that's what I'm working on, and this will occupy me for, I would say, the next year or two. which who knows in what shape I will.
So I think we have time for one more question. And since I haven't seen any from the jumping out at me at the chat, I would like to inform the audience. Oh, Constanza, you have a question?
I have not really a question, just a short remark, just a real thank you. So my husband's Jewish Hungarian grandmother always cooked for me, and I'm sitting here, and we never could, after she passed away, she always did a certain cucumber salad, they're very special, and we never could recreate it. And I was so moved when I heard you talking about, and I was so regretting that we never asked her to write it down. Now when I'm getting home, I have to ask him to make me some makos nudli, because I miss him so much. So thank you so very much.
But again, interesting that, of course, Jews ate the so-called uniquely Jewish dishes, the traditional Jewish dishes, almost exclusively only on holidays, on Shabbat or on Jewish holidays. But during the week, almost all Jews ate basically Christian dishes. If they kept kashrut, then kosher versions of the Christian dishes, or if they did not keep kosher, then just plain straight Christian dishes, and that's usually not known and acknowledged, that traditional, authentic, or I would say uniquely Jewish dishes were almost exclusively holiday dishes. And the cucumber salad and poppy seed noodles are essentially, they are Christian dishes, very commonly prepared by Jews, including my mother, who was not at all religious and certainly did not keep kosher, but liked it. But interestingly, and that is perhaps the last little detail that I can say, is that even people who became assimilated and atheistic and atheists and of course did not keep kosher, they frequently retained some vestiges of traditional Jewish cuisine. And for example, my mother made paprikash, which is a sort of traditional Hungarian dish. It's a stew. And paprikash always has, of course, paprika in it, some meat, and sour cream. But my mother always prepared it without sour cream. And I always kept wondering, why on earth does she leave out the sour cream? And as I said, she was not at all religious, and it was clearly a vestige from her grandmother, my great-grandmother, who always, of course, cooked it without sour cream, because you cannot mix dairy with fatty meat products. So there are such vestiges even in the cuisine of the cooking of people who no longer are religious and no longer keep kosher.
Well, Andras, thank you so much for having this conversation with us, for sharing your insights into so many topics: Hungarian culinary history, cookbook history. I was going to tell the audience that, contrary to what you might have learned on this call, Andras was also a trained architect and had worked for many years as an architect. So at some point, maybe hopefully we'll have you back where we can talk about Jewish architecture and also the relationship between architecture and culinary history.
Thank you very much, and thank you for awarding me with this wonderful prize.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming.